Hi, everyone. Welcome back to a new episode of Dare to Be Fearless. Before I get into this episode, make sure that you're following the show on Instagram and all social media platforms at Dare to Be Fearless, as well as my personal social media, which is at Alexa_Curtis. I'm really excited about today's guest because we're going to talk about networking and cold emailing, which is something that I know many of you know that I'm low-key obsessed with. And then quick shout out as well to Chief Swag Officer. If you want to get any customized microphone covers or any of our newest products, I am going to put in the show notes a discount code for you to use that you can shop exclusively on chiefswagofficer.com. So my guest today and I met at Slush, which is this crazy cool tech VC conference in Helsinki. Emma is amazing. She's now a senior writer at Fortune. You head one of their biggest newsletters. You were at the New York Stock Exchange this morning, and you live in Bed-Stuy, which is where I used to live. So, just that was a quick summary on you, but can you explain how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, I love that. Alexa, thank you so much for having me. And you're right, Slush was amazing. I'm so glad we got to meet there.
I think Slush was by far the best conference I've ever gone to.
And I loved Helsinki. I was like, this is slept on. I would love to come back.
I know. I literally, every time I would post on TikTok, I was in Helsinki. So people were so nice and everyone was like, you have to come back and you have to do this. And I wasn't there. You flew out, I think, right that day. You weren't there for more than.
I was there for a little bit before.
Okay.
And there was one day where it was not disgusting outside.
Yeah.
And that day it was like, I love it here. I could come back. And it wasn't as cold as New York with the wind tunnels.
Yeah.
It was nice and sunny.
There's some area apparently called Lapland.
I did not make it out there.
No, I didn't make it out there either, but I want to next time. But, through this episode, I would love to talk about a bit about networking. And I know you mentioned prior to this about cold emailing, et cetera, because I think a lot of people don't know how to properly do that. But yes, okay, backstory. Georgetown, you worked at the paper there.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. Yeah, so I went to college at Georgetown where I was super interested in journalism. Georgetown did not have a journalism school, so I found ways to do that, mostly through the college paper there, which is called The Hoya, where I spent a lot of my time. I feel like you asked what I majored in, which is government, but I feel like I barely spent any time doing that. I spent most of my time just in the newspaper office. Georgetown is, of course, in Washington, D.C., so you're in a major city, obviously very newsy city, so there's lots of opportunities to really figure out what it means to be a journalist outside of just your campus and with the world around you. So I was able to cover, I think there was a criminal trial of a student at Georgetown who had made ricin in his dorm room. And so I went to that and, obviously engaged there was a mayoral race in DC at the time. So we did a lot of coverage that really reflected more what it would be like to be a journalist after graduation. So after that, I went to the Houston Chronicle and I was a reporter there for a year, which was a great experience to report, somewhere besides the East Coast where I had spent my entire life up until that point. And then I did not think I would go into business journalism, but I'd had a little bit of an experience at an internship at USA Today, and so I had that on my resume. And there are a lot of jobs in business journalism. I think everyone talks about how it's tough to be a journalist, but business journalism is this corner where you can do a lot of really interesting work, and there is often more opportunity than there is as just a general assignment or general news writer. And so I ended up in business journalism, which I think is a lot more interesting than people give it credit for. There's so many interesting stories there, especially today with, obviously topics like networking and cold emailing. That's all part of business. It's all part of career and lifestyle and how you have the career and the life that you want. And so I've been at Fortune for 6 years and been able to support and build our most powerful women franchise.
Wait, you studied government studies?
I studied government, yeah.
But how does government relate to journalism?
I think I was in DC, and so it was a really popular major. And of course, government was their version of political science. So if you're interested in journalism, perhaps you think you might cover politics. Yeah. So it was just kind of a topic area to focus on. And I think it was I learned a lot. And obviously, as an informed citizen, you want to know what's going on in the government anyway. So it kind of applies throughout your life, no matter what.
Did you like going to college in DC? I have a decent amount of friends who went to college in DC. I don't think I could personally live there, but I do like DC.
I really liked it as a student. I think Georgetown is pretty separate from the rest of the city. It definitely has a campus feel. There's no metro stop in Georgetown, so a lot of students don't really make it into the rest of the city that much. I'm with you. I don't know if I really would love to live there as an adult these
No.
days. I think I'm really attached to New York, and DC can be a little sleepy, a little quiet, but it's a really great city.
I forgot to ask what part of Brooklyn. You're in Bed-Stuy, but where in Bed-Stuy?
I'm like on the border with Clinton Hill and Crown Heights, so you get kind of the best of all three worlds.
Yeah, I was at 360 Franklin Avenue off, I think, the C train on Franklin.
Yeah.
I remember it because I had started as a blogger, so I remember there was a coffee shop there, and it was like, I was so broke, but I would go there all the time and write on my blog, and I loved Bed-Stuy. But I mean, I said to you before this, like, Bed-Stuy has changed so much, but in 2016, you weren't living there then.
In 2016, I had just moved back to New York that summer from Houston, and I lived in Chelsea that first year I was back, so I wasn't there yet.
No, I love Chelsea. But anyhow, okay, so then you mentioned an internship at USA Today
Yeah.
that you got during college.
Yes.
How did that transpire?
Yeah, I think that's a really great example of some of what we've talked about, which is this idea of when you talk about cold emailing, just kind of like raising your hand for things and putting yourself out there. I had done this program they had at the time for college journalists where over the summer you wrote for a college vertical that USA Today had about like college issues, and it was totally virtual, and I wrote one article a week, and it was I was really happy to do it, and it was a great experience. But then when that ended, since I was based in DC and USA Today is based outside of DC in Virginia, I sent them an email and I was like, hey, I'm going to be back on campus. Do you have any like actual in-office internships? And they said yes, but I asked super late. It was like 2 weeks before the semester started. And they said yes, but the only one left is on their business desk. And so that was how I ended up doing my first experience in business journalism.
Do you feel like looking back at college, an internship unpaid is worth the time and energy?
I think these days, most places, I think being paid as an intern now can be seen often as like a metric for what your experience of that internship will be like. I think maybe 10 years ago, an unpaid internship could do a lot more for you, but now a lot of the places that didn't always pay, they do pay now. And so I think the places that still don't pay, it probably says something about, how seriously they take that internship experience, how much they'll support your career and try to help you figure out what you want to do after. I think there's some rare exceptions, industries where that's still uncommon, but I think at this point, most internships should be paying.
It's wild to me because when I look back on I'm 27, like the early years of my career, it was like slave labor. I would do like anyone coffee, and it was so expected that you would do that. And I think now, 50% of this generation has been able to be like so forward with what they want, but because I think of social media, they want this success so fast. And I feel like people who were not born with these cell phones in our hands, like you really had to work you had to go to college, you had to like learn, you had to do an unpaid internship, for better or for worse. But like, it's just different looking back and thinking like, wow, I did all of this stuff for free just because you wanted to get in the door with someone. Whereas now someone's like, I can just write a DM and like potentially get a job.
Yeah, there are a lot more ways to get your foot in the door now. So I think the appeal of an unpaid internship has really declined.
Do you feel like though, if someone has the opportunity to have an unpaid internship and it's a really big opportunity, should take it, or I guess really put their foot down and say like, no, I need to be paid?
I wouldn't say put their foot down, but I would say think really hard about the opportunity and what it's giving you besides a salary. Is this a person you really want to work for? Is this a person whose career you really admire? Is this someone who is going to get you that next opportunity? Or is this just something that is unpaid and, you don't really feel like it's going to benefit you in any other tangible way?
So when it comes to going from USA Today to the Houston Chronicle is where you went, you then were brought to Houston, or you did it remotely?
I moved to Houston for a year. Yeah, I applied to this program that I believe they still have called the Hearst Journalism Fellowship. The Houston Chronicle is owned by Hearst, and you applied and they placed you at one of their newspapers. And so I ended up in Houston.
What do you feel like has changed over the years with journalism? Because newspapers nowadays, they're like kind of outdated, but they're still around. Like everyone I know that's older reads a newspaper. But I have actually two really good friends who also worked in media and then ended up for some reason at like the Austin Chronicle or the Houston Chronicle, like both of them. I don't know if Houston ends up taking a lot of like on the verge of coming up journalists or what it is, but you both are there.
Yeah, the Houston Chronicle is a really great paper. They have some amazing journalists there. I think certainly what's changed is like the business of newspapers. And, even obviously before my time there, newspapers used to be a really thriving business that had tons of ad revenue. Obviously, it's a different landscape now. But I think, something that's changed about the path to a career as a journalist is for many years, many people said, what you do is you start at a small town paper, you move up to a different metro paper, eventually move to a major metro market. And I think that path is not really the path that makes sense for a lot of people these days. I certainly started in Houston and then ended up moving back to New York. But Houston is a major metro market. That's not starting at a small town paper like a lot of people typically started their careers a couple decades ago. So I think people just have more options now, the same as whether it's worth it to do an unpaid internship. You don't necessarily have to move to the middle of nowhere to get your start in journalism. You can write on your own. You can build your own platform. You can freelance. You can obviously, write for national publications living somewhere else. So there's just a lot more opportunities, and there's not just one path.
It reminds me a lot of TV because anyone I know who is a news anchor, I mean, ideally you start, I guess, in a really small area. Think of a girl I went to acting camp with, and now she does like this. I think she started like Burlington, Vermont, and then she's now gone to like Boston, and then ideally you end up on like the Today Show or Good Morning America. And it seems like it's a bit similar with like papers. If you start in this small town, you kind of work your way up.
I think it used to be really similar. I think for a lot of journalists, print journalists, that's not really the path anymore. But I think it used to be really similar for sure.
So when it comes to like the salary of a journalist or someone in media, especially with magazines versus like newspapers, what is the difference in that? And how do they even choose, the salary versus from like a writer? Because I think a lot of people don't realize there's freelance writers who write for multiple different publications, but the way that media and like magazines has changed so much, like even Teen Vogue doesn't even really have the same, I think, appeal that it used to, where it was like this top magazine, and now I see like 20-year-olds or like editors at some of these magazines.
Yeah, I mean, every publication is different when it comes to salary, and freelance rates differ across publications too. I think we've talked about in working in business journalism. I think in business journalism, salaries tend to be a little bit better than they are in general interest news. So that's one bonus of the field. But yeah, I think it's kind of certainly if you watch like Sex and the City and Carrie Bradshaw was getting like $4 a word from Vogue. I think like Vogue writers are now like getting less than that, not adjusted for inflation. So freelance rates have totally changed over the past couple decades.
Because you've been at Fortune 6 years, right? Mm-hmm. So has it shifted at all with you? Because a lot of times these publications, even like BuzzFeed, I see, are lay people off all the time. So like what part of that with the industry is real, and why, in your opinion, do these layoffs happen with these publications?
Yeah, I mean, I think layoffs are definitely real. I was laid off once. I worked for Mashable. And the company was acquired by Ziff Davis, and I was laid off during that transaction.
What was your role there?
I was a business reporter, and they had a business team and a tech team, and they combined them. And so they cut a couple of us who were on the business desk. And, it was really tough, but it ended up working out for my career. I think what the one positive thing about layoffs is that I think a lot of the media industry has tried to really rally and support people when these kind of especially mass layoffs happen. And so I got a ton of support from people in my network, people I didn't even realize were in my network, was able to find some opportunities, and it really set me on the path to then end up at Fortune a few months later.
In between the layoff from Mashable and then Fortune, do you remember what was going through your head? Were you starting to cold email people? Were you kind of waiting for opportunities to come to you?
Yeah, I had another job in between that I just had for a couple months. And so I was definitely, relieved to have that opportunity. That was a cold email from someone who was hiring. And so I, interviewed and got that pretty quickly. But it was definitely, it was scary. It was unknown. I was, I think, 24 when I was laid off. And so I've been working for a couple of years, but it was definitely uncharted territory. I didn't know what to do. The idea of not knowing what's next was something that I didn't know how to handle. But I think looking to others for guidance, being part of a community of journalists, of others who'd been part of that layoff, of others who I'd met who were working, who were keeping an eye out for other opportunities, was super helpful in just kind of focusing on the positive and what could come next.
If someone's watching this and is going through having been laid off or not sure what to do in between jobs, especially in media entertainment, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I would say, don't be shy about asking people for help. I think often people really want to help, and especially if they respect you, respect your work, no one will be upset to hear from you. And I think when you talk to different generations, some people will say, like, don't post about your layoff on LinkedIn. Like, people will feel like there's a stigma against it.
Why?
Some people think that, it's not something that you should advertise, and that's just how some generations felt about that. But, personally, I think that as long as you post about it in the right way, share the news with, kind of a positive tone, obviously it's tough, but, tell your contacts that, you're excited about what comes next. Here's what you have to offer. Here's some ideas for how you could work together. I think people really want to help more than you think they do.
I had a friend in London and she was laid off, but she had like a big settlement, and I was kind of helping her with her LinkedIn page. And so I'm so entrepreneurial that I'm just like, whatever I think, post in like a good way. But I mean, I sat with her for probably 2 hours, like rewriting her fucking, like, I was laid off and like I got a big settlement. And I'm like, I don't think we need to think this much about it. Cause I think also at the end of the day, like, everyone's on LinkedIn scrolling. Who's really paying attention? Like, someone may see it and be like, oh, I'm so sorry, but then they're on to the next thing. I think people on these platforms, especially LinkedIn, because LinkedIn's become like an Instagram. It's this strange world of like, what even is this platform anymore? So I feel like also not overthinking it in that capacity, but also perhaps putting out like an olive branch to anyone who is looking to hire someone in your field could be beneficial.
Exactly. I mean, for instance, with your friend's example, I don't think people need to know that someone's just been laid off and that they have a decent severance package. I think what they need to know is, my time at this company has come to an end. I'm ready for my next opportunity. Here are the things I'm excited to do. Here's how I would love to work with you. Here's how you can help me.
I love that, like, my time at this company has come to an end. I think that's, again, I think people, they're so tempted because of the internet and people are so vocal about their thoughts. Sometimes just less words is better. You don't need to open the door to like exactly what happened.
Yeah. I mean, and then you get like, the like whole TikTok recording your layoff and crying video genre, which is
Did you cover that?
No, but that's beyond me.
What is that even, like, what happened? I don't really know what. I think maybe I've seen that, but
yeah, there were some people who were recording their layoffs and posting the videos on TikTok, and I think that one's tough. I mean, obviously people are create content all kinds of ways, but that one probably, if future employer sees it, they might not want you to be recording your layoff.
I'm curious. Fortune to me is something that's a much more older and wiser publication, like the way that even the newsletter and even the landing page in comparison to the Morning Brew, and also then comparing, say, Fortune to like a Teen Vogue or a 17. When you went into this role, were the people who hiring you, were they looking for you to also have your own personal brand and like social media presence, or no?
Yeah, I mean, Fortune is 95 years old. Actually, you mentioned we were at the stock exchange this morning, and Fortune was there ringing the opening bell to celebrate its 95th birthday. And so it's a legacy publication that comes with a lot of the benefits of that. You have this amazing history of amazing journalism for almost a century, people who wrote these incredible magazine pieces, some of those folks who worked there for 50 years, and we have some colleagues who worked with these amazing journalists. One of our conference rooms is named after a woman named Carol Loomis, who's in her 90s, who worked at Fortune for 50 years, wrote amazing stories. I believe Fortune coined the terms hedge fund and trophy wife.
Good day.
So yeah, that's an amazing legacy if you ask me, especially trophy wife.
Oh yeah.
But obviously, and then you have the downsides of that. I think Fortune was slower to adapt to the digital age than some other publications. For a while, Fortune didn't even have a website. It was part of CNN Money, and that was one platform. And so Fortune now, I think we have an amazing social team and SEO team and all of that stuff, audience team, who really get our journalism out there. And when I started, I think, it's important for every journalist to have a personal brand. I was joining to support a franchise that's been around for 25 plus years called the Most Powerful Women franchise at Fortune, where we publish an annual list of the most powerful women in business and host an annual summit gathering a lot of those CEOs and executives once a year with some other touch points throughout the year. And so building a personal brand was really important to me. I wouldn't say it was the top thing that Fortune was looking for from me when they hired me.
At other publications, I would assume that perhaps that's something they're looking for, more of like the younger ones, do you think? Because they want you to be able to also perhaps bring your presence to the publication, or no?
I think a lot of publications are looking for that for sure. And I think Fortune these days is definitely encouraging staffers to think that way and get their content out there to audiences across all kinds of platforms. So, when I worked at Mashable, that was obviously a very upstart digital first organization. And there was definitely a focus on, writing with voice and reaching audiences across platforms. But I think it's important everywhere.
I'm still curious though. Can you say the base salary for, or what it kind of entails for like freelance writers versus say someone who is like an editor at a larger publication?
Yeah, I don't know. It really ranges, and I think it depends on your market and what you're doing. When I started at the Houston Chronicle, the Hearst Journalism Fellowship, salary across the board, across markets, entry level was $40,000 a year.
Okay. It's low though.
Yeah, it was low, but that was 2015. Okay. I'm not sure what it is today, so don't quote me on that for right now. But I was living in Texas. It was a livable salary,
for sure.
For sure. But yeah, but I don't know what it is today.
Yeah. But with other publications, like say top editors at other media outlets.
Yeah, I think it really depends. I think journalism. It's rare that it's a field where you're going to be raking in millions and millions of dollars, but you can definitely make a good living and advance your career in more ways than you'd expect when you kind of hear the doom and gloom stories of layoffs and trouble in the media industry.
What about the difference between like the freelancers versus the people who are actually on the masthead? Because I think a lot of people might not know what that means. So it would be nice, I think, to have someone in your position say like,
yeah, totally. I think freelancers usually get paid per article, and so that's a different rate depending on what the publication is and what type of story it is. I think sometimes that will be per word, sometimes that will be per piece, and so it really depends on the publication. But you'll see often editors posting on Twitter or whatever, say I'm looking for this kind of story, this kind of personal essay, and I can pay $200 for the piece. If you're longer pieces, whether at a magazine or somewhere else, sometimes it'll be, like $1 a word and you're writing a 2,000-word story. But it really depends.
But correct me if I'm wrong, the difference between the freelancers is that they're always, in my opinion, like kind of living on the edge with their next paycheck, right? Because they have to pitch the article. And then someone who actually works like at the company, you're probably not, I would assume, allowed to go and like do freelance pieces for like Vogue, or can you?
I think it really depends on everyone's individual situation. Freelancing can be really, really hard. A lot of people are really successful at freelancing and have built incredible networks and have tons of great story ideas and are able to, make a really great living doing that. So I think it really depends. If you're on staff, certainly you're like mostly focused on writing for that publication. The rules on whether you're allowed to do stuff elsewhere, I think, differ depending on your personal situation.
Do you do other writing or just Fortune?
Yeah, I'm mostly focused on Fortune, but I have a lot of great opportunities, and we get to do a newsletter, a magazine, stuff like this, live interviewing on stage, and so it gets to kind of check all the boxes.
I feel like if you've got a full-time job at a publication, it would not be probably traditional, right, to go do like freelance work somewhere else.
Yeah, I think it really depends, and also on what kind of journalism you're doing. I think it's probably more common in like entertainment journalism. Sometimes you'll see someone who works somewhere else than doing a cover story for a different publication or something like that. But it really differs, so it's hard to have like blanket rules.
Do you mostly get pitched ideas, or are you usually finding them?
It's definitely a combination. We'll, come up with ideas or follow people who we think we should be writing about, stories we should be covering. We'll cover the news cycle. So obviously right now, big issue is kind of the anti-DEI effort in Washington with Trump and Elon Musk going after DEI in the federal government and also for federal contractors, which means for most of the business world. We'll also have folks pitch us and say, this is a really great founder you should know about. This is someone you should be covering. And I read all those pitches. Sometimes the person makes sense for us, sometimes they don't, but it's a combination for sure.
How do you get in like a Fortune, or how do you get someone like yours attention via pitch? Anything that you've gotten that you like, and what are things that people do wrong when they pitch editors like yourself?
Yeah, I would say the number one mistake is not knowing who you're pitching to or what they write about. I'm sure you've heard that before, but typically you can tell immediately whether someone reads your work and whether they know if you're the right person they should be pitching. I think for us, I write our daily newsletter. It's called Most Powerful Women Daily, or MPW Daily. It used to be called the Broadsheet for 10 years and had a large following as that as well before I worked there. So I feel like I can say that. But so since that's a daily product that goes out into people's inboxes 5 days a week, they have a really direct connection to it. So often the pitches we get are actually better than pitches that journalists would get who just write across, for a website or a publication or something like that, because people do read it every single day. It's part of their routine. So they really know the kind of thing we want to cover, and they know whether what they have is a fit for us. And so a lot of the inbound we get is really actually something that we'd be interested in covering. And there's this sense of community between people who read the newsletter, people who are in the newsletter, people who are part of the Most Powerful Women franchise throughout Fortune in other ways. But yeah, to get our attention, I think often the core thing is just if the person you're pitching, whether you're pitching yourself or whether a publicist is pitching someone else, is whether they're the right fit for us. I don't think there's so much you can do in an email that can make up for something just not being the right fit. Certainly, there are things that can easily get you kind of quickly written off, whether that's, for instance, we write a newsletter that's about women. So are you pitching a male CEO? That's probably not the right fit for us. That's pretty basic.
Do you reply to those pitches?
It depends. I think typically no, I'll probably just delete them and move on. I don't think it's really worth anyone's time to make a big fuss over it. But yeah, and also I think, with founders, I think Fortune has typically a big focus on like big business versus like early stage startups. Yeah. And so sometimes something can be a bit too early stage for us. But if a pitch can speak to here's where this specific company fits in a broader ecosystem, a broader industry, here's why this story is bigger than just this company that still only has 5 employees or, isn't profitable yet. That's definitely something that can help make something stand out, as well as this idea that when you are pitching something, can you speak to, who this person is, and do they have a compelling story apart from their business that really just creates a great narrative? I think, as journalists, you're a storyteller, so you're just looking for great narrative a lot of the time. So, this company's small, but here's why this person's backstory before that, or where they're headed in the future, really add something to it that you should consider.
When you're getting a pitch, do you notice or take any difference in your response if someone's pitching on behalf of themselves? Like, hi, Emma, I'm Alexa Curtis, versus like, hey, Emma, I'm Morgan, and I, am on Alexa's team. Does that make any difference to you? I always wonder this.
Yeah, I don't think there's any hard and fast rules. I would say there's no reason to not look at a pitch from someone because they're pitching themselves. But I will say that there does tend to be a correlation where companies that are of the stage that Fortune is generally looking for tend to have folks in place working on PR and media. So it's relatively rare that someone pitching themselves talking about like a company with a founder, not necessarily like someone who's like, has a podcast or working in media. I think that's very different because you're not necessarily like hiring a team of publicists when you're building something like that. But if you're building like a revenue generating, product-based business or service-based business, typically having someone to handle that for you is a sign that you're just like at the stage that Fortune. But there are always exceptions to that rule. A lot of founders do really great founder-led PR. And if it's something that founder really has a skill at and is passionate at, and is good at and passionate about, then that can totally make a lot of difference.
What about with subject lines in emails? I mean, you must, I don't know actually, with your position, do you come up with the titles of articles as well or no?
Often it's a collaboration with folks at Fortune, whether it's writers, editors, our social and audience team, and coming up with the best headlines.
So how can someone make or craft the best subject line to get an editor's attention?
I say the best thing to do is just always think about it as if you're in the other person's shoes. So for me, if I'm thinking about an email I'm sending to someone about an interview I want to do, a meeting I want to set up, I work at Fortune, so I have a million things in my inbox with the subject line, Fortune. but they don't. And so for them, the relevant fact is that it's an email from Fortune. So just say like, inquiry from Fortune interview opportunity is fine. Whereas if someone's emailing me and they say Fortune story, I'm like, I have 5 million things and I don't know what that is. And so when someone's emailing me, I think they should say what's relevant about them. You just always have to think about how the other person is viewing it.
Okay. What about also cold messaging someone on LinkedIn or a DM for a pitch? Because I notice people do that a lot. I mean, even with this show, like I only take pitches via email, and I definitely notice if someone emails as a publicist or as themselves, et cetera, and I take, different attention to the way that the pitch comes. But I personally don't appreciate pitches via a DM or a LinkedIn message because like my email is just my work, and everything else to me seems so fluid with like my personal life versus work.
Totally. I mean, I would say like the main thing is just like for people who are pitching to pay attention to what the person you're trying to get the attention of, what they have said is the best system for them. So if they have in their bio pitches via email only, no pitches via DM, like don't think like you're the exception to that and try to DM them. And I think to your point about if someone has publicist versus pitching yourself, I often think like, if you're just having a more casual conversation with someone who you might be interested to have on your podcast or do a story about over DM, like that's something that probably makes more sense to happen over DM. Like if you're just like building contacts, building relationships, but should publicists be in your DM sending pitches? No, that should probably happen over email.
Yeah. I do appreciate though, like a follow-up DM, like sometimes, and I would love to get your opinion on the follow-up because I think that's the most underlooked part of actually the media circus. And I don't think people who are not in this industry realize how critical the follow-up is. But I don't mind if someone's like, hey, I sent you an email, would love to see if you got it. Because I'll send that to someone on LinkedIn and then I find I get their attention. But it started with the pitch being on email. And then I would send it to an editor or publish whatever and say like, hey, I did send you an email. I would love to see if you confirmed it. Because then I find sometimes someone will be like, oh, wow, I did see the email, but I forgot to reply. And then they send you back in the DM.
Totally. I think as long as you're polite, you're not really acting like someone owes you their time, follow-up is totally fine. I think you can just be polite, be nice, be normal, be a human. I think that's the key to all of this. And I'm sure if you're, sitting there sending out tons and tons of emails, it can be frustrating if people don't get back to you. Yeah. But just try not to take it personally, not to let that frustration come through in your messages to people, not to send a million follow-ups if you maybe follow up once. And if
only follow up once,
I think if it's something where it's like you really feel like this just didn't get their attention and you really know that this is a great opportunity, maybe follow up twice. But I would say sending 4 follow-ups,
really?
5 follow-ups.
Oh, wow.
Maybe to journalists, okay. I would say. I don't think is I don't, unless you like really know. For instance, I have a good example, I think. In 2023, I did a profile for Fortune of Kim Kardashian. And we had this opportunity. We wanted to do a story about the private equity firm she was launching. Yes. Yeah. And, I was like, I think they would want to do this. I was emailing Kim's publicist and she wasn't answering me. And I was like, I'm sure her inbox is absolutely crazy. And it is. She's great. She represents all of the Kardashian sisters. So, she's busy.
Is it just one publicist?
Just one, yeah. So she's got a lot going on. I sent her an email, sent her a follow-up, didn't hear from her. And I was like, okay, but I think they would want to talk about this at least. Even if they don't know if they want to do the opportunity, I think they would want to discuss it. I remembered I had met a contact at an event who was a venture capitalist who was on the board of Skims. And so I shot him a note and said, like, hey, we met a couple weeks ago. I'm trying to get in touch with Kim's publicist about this story idea. Would you be able to ping her or do you think they'd be interested? And he was like, oh yeah, I'll shoot her a note. And then she got back to me. And so it was just like thinking about, is this opportunity worth it? Do I hope they would want to do it? Or do I genuinely think they'd be interested in it? And what's a way I can get to them without being annoying? And, Kim's publicist, she was vacationing in Europe for a couple of weeks and she was super behind on email and, we chatted and it went from there. But
did the story run?
Yeah, the story ran. We did it. And, I think it really was about thinking creatively and thinking about follow-up, not just as sending email after email, but thinking about, how to just make that initial connection in a way that worked.
There's 2 parts of that I'd love to unpack. Number 1 being, if you didn't have that mutual connection, would you have kept emailing?
If I didn't have that mutual connection, I think I probably would have tried to find a different connection because I think I had come to the conclusion that she had a crazy inbox. We hadn't met yet. I knew some people who worked at her firm, but I hadn't worked with the actual publicist who worked with Kim yet. So she didn't recognize my name in her inbox immediately. So I probably would have reached out to someone else who worked at the same PR firm as her and tried to make that connection in a different way. I don't think I would have kept sending multiple follow-up emails.
And then the other person you mentioned you had met 2 weeks before, like very recently at an event.
Probably like a month earlier.
Okay. Which is a bit of a casual favor to ask, right? What made you feel like you were able to do that? Because a lot of people will go to networking events and then they'll meet someone and then, they don't want to push or they don't want to pry, but like you have to push and you have to fucking pry. Otherwise, like you're never going to get anywhere in business. So it's kind of baller that like you had just met him and were like, hey, by the way, can you like tell Kim Kardashian's publicist to reply to my email?
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about it, I wouldn't have thought about it as asking for a favor. I think this was an opportunity that was interesting to their team too. And I knew that I think they would potentially be interested in, Kim hadn't done a Fortune story before, like a big magazine one. And I thought that, this is something that would be interesting to her team too. So certainly it's a favor to say like, would you be able to ping her if it makes sense for you to do that? But it was also the fact that, I felt like I was not just asking for a favor for myself. It was had something to offer to them as well. And also we'd had a conversation at that event about, the stories I do for Fortune about female business leaders. He'd asked if I'd done a story on Kim before. And so we'd already talked about these themes kind of. And so it wasn't just totally out of nowhere.
Yeah, no, it sounds like you obviously trusted your gut knowing that like this makes sense for your, if you were not at like Fortune or if someone was, say, an independent writer or blogger, et cetera, and wanted to get to like the Kim Kardashians of the world, do you think, like honestly, that a cold pitch to a publicist with someone at that level is worth their time? Or is there a better way for them to go about getting a name for themselves as a journalist to get those kind of interviews?
I think that's a lot tougher. That was one reason I felt comfortable asking for that, was because I knew that the Fortune brand was something that they would really be interested in. If I was just on my own, freelance journalist, I hadn't placed a story at a particular publication, I had my own podcast or newsletter I was doing, I probably might not have used that strategy. And so I think, but I think there are certainly, if you're interested in those kinds of names, there are certainly tons of people in that orbit that you could reach out to and build relationships with. I think it's all about, building relationships over time. So are you interested in, PR and media? Maybe there's someone who has a really interesting role, just to use the Kardashians as an example, working with their business ventures or handling that, who would be a really interesting conversation. You don't always have to talk to the marquee, hard to reach person. There are interesting stories to tell at all levels.
I get a lot of inquiries by like aspiring influencer content creators about, getting brand pitches, et cetera. And people always want to go and charge a brand or like get in the door with a brand, but they have no experience. And it's the same way that like, why would a brand pay you when you have no credit? So either doing, a free piece or taking product, et cetera, and getting a testimony. And I think of journalism in the same way as like, if you're just starting out, interviewing as many younger founders so people can even get a sense of your writing to then get in front of, say, like a Kim Kardashian to be profiled.
Yeah, I think it's all about just thinking about building relationships and giving time for things to happen over time. Things shouldn't be transactional. For instance, to use your example, it probably doesn't make sense to just reach out to a brand and say, here are my rates and this is what I'm looking for. It might make sense to reach out to someone who works at that brand, who you have a connection to somehow, and say like, I'm getting started, I'm building my platform, I love your brand, here's why. I'm going to post about it anyway because I'm so obsessed with it. But if there's ever an opportunity to work together, like I'd love to stay in touch. Mm-hmm. So I think it's, I always appreciate building connections with people in our orbit at Fortune, whether it's people who are building businesses, people who work to support those businesses, publicists, et cetera, that are really genuine, that are not transactional, where we can have a conversation and there's not an expectation of immediate coverage coming out of it. Where we can, just really build a relationship. I think that's the key.
Have you pitched people and them said no to being interviewed by you?
Yeah, I think that happens all the time.
Why?
Especially when you're talking about big businesses, Fortune 500 businesses, companies have different media strategies, and there are a lot of considerations at play. Sometimes some executives really like doing live interviews on stage, but they don't want to participate in like a magazine length written story.
So interesting, because it's like that seems like such a dumb thing to say no to free publicity with such a big outlet.
Yeah, I don't know. Not everyone feels like they need it. People, especially, these days, as we talked about, it applies to all kinds of businesses too. There are a lot of opportunities to get your message out there that don't depend on being in a publication that comes with the journalistic standards and the rules that are part of that. So not everyone wants to do it. And, that's fine. But of course, as journalists, we have the ability to say, we want to do this story anyway. So we can do what's called a write around story, where you write about a person without their cooperation by talking to people who know them, people in their orbit, and painting a portrait of them that doesn't depend on their participation. So everyone has options. Everyone has choices.
I'm curious what a day in the life of a journalist or an editor. I don't like journalists. I feel like you're higher. How do I say this properly without sounding like bitch? Like you're higher than a journalist because you're so high at the company. So you're not like, someone new and just like pitching ideas. So what is a day in your life like?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's workflow is different. At the moment, I write our daily newsletter called Most Powerful Women Daily. And so that's a product that goes out at 9:30 a.m. Eastern every day. And so
how long does one newsletter take you to write?
I have an amazing fellow who is at Fortune who supports me on it. Her name's Nina, and she's been doing a great job. And so she helps me with it. If she is not working on it, then it probably takes about 3 to 4 hours to do the whole thing. Okay. But typically the day starts by sending out one that's been prepped the day before, sweeping, just doing a quick sweep of the internet to see if any major news broke overnight that really should be included. We have a team of newsletter production editors who do the mechanics of actually sending the newsletter every morning, but I, review it on my phone and make sure everything looks good before it gets sent to all of our subscribers. Then and that happens, around like 8:30 in the morning. Then I start my day. I'll typically have a few meetings, interviews scheduled. I'm usually bopping around between home, our office downtown. I'll also have meetings and interviews with CEOs and business leaders that are around the city. So I'm not typically in one place for like 8 hours. But yeah, I have some, internal meetings as well, working on major projects. For instance, this year I'm editing our Most Powerful Women list, which is a major internal project, involves collaborating with colleagues across the globe because it's a global list, and we need to tap our colleagues in Asia and in Europe to understand who the business leaders, the women business leaders are in those regions that we should consider for the list this year. So that's a big endeavor. At the end of the day, I write the newsletter for the next day. I tend to have lots of conversations with people and keep those ideas banked so that we always have something to turn back to when there's nothing really going on in the news that day that's relevant for us. So, whether I've done an interview with an athlete or with a startup founder, or I have an exclusive bit of news about a startup and something they're launching, or I've done an interview with a Fortune 500 CEO, we have that. But then kind of first we'll look at what's happening in the news that day. So obviously right now, there's been a lot. So in the past month, we've done, a write-up about Nikki Glaser at the Golden Globes, Trump's DEI executive orders, female founders and their responses to the wildfires in California, the Grammys this week. And so we're covering across politics, entertainment, culture, business. Breaking news in business can be something like, this isn't breaking news for like the entire world, but in this world, it was a big deal. One of two very prominent female executives at JP Morgan announced that she was no longer interested in being considered for the JP Morgan CEO job to replace Jamie Dimon. So that would be breaking news for our audience. So there's all kinds of things that happen and that we'll cover. And then try to balance that with working on longer term projects, magazine features, and get ready for the next day.
That's a lot. Oh my God. That's a lot. With the difference between like a Forbes and a Fortune, and I mean, you don't have to comment on this, but like it's pretty notorious of like people paying to get on these like Forbes 30 under 30 lists. And I see a lot and know a lot of kind of people who have been on that, and I see a lot of good, and I also see a lot of not so good with that particular publication. So what is the difference between like the Fortune list and the demographic of who's reading a Fortune versus a Forbes?
Yeah, I haven't worked at Forbes, so I can't speak to exactly, how they work. I do have a lot of colleagues who have worked at Forbes, and there are some amazing journalists there. So I think, they have some great journalists there within the operation for sure. But I think I can speak to our Most Powerful Women list, which, I think, especially when you think about women's media and kind of content about women in business, a lot of it can be just really like inspirational and, this person is amazing and here's why. And I think that can be great. And we do some of that coverage too, because sometimes it's the truth, but we're also doing this coverage as part of Fortune, which means that we're also covering when things are not going well. We're also, I think from the macro sense, the best thing to do to support women leaders as journalists is to cover them like anyone else. So covering women only positively does not reinforce them as leaders, because it, is like a special way of covering things. So we want to elevate these stories. We want to find business leaders who are not being covered in the headlines every single day other places, but we're still doing real journalism about them. And so I think that's something that has distinguished Fortune's approach to this coverage area. When it comes to the most powerful women list, we look at, it's really metric driven. So I think some other lists about like powerful women are kind of like all over the place, because it'll be like, here's Taylor Swift, here's Ursula von der Leyen in Europe.
Example, yeah.
And so ours is only business executives. So it's it's only business. It's not like someone in another field. It's not really celebrity, although Kim was on it one year, but that was because of her business endeavors. It's about the size of the business that person's running. It's about the health of that business. Obviously, you can have a huge business that's not doing well. It's about that executive's career trajectory. So is she someone who is in a lower role now, but is really expected to be a successor for the CEO role or go on to do amazing things in her career? It's about her influence outside of just the role she's in. So something like the Sheryl Sandberg effect, where this is her job at Meta, but obviously, or at Facebook at the time, but obviously had tons of influence outside the walls of her company. And then there's also this factor of how is she, wielding her power in the world? What is she choosing to do with it? And so those are the factors that we look at. We're looking at numbers, we're looking at revenue, we're looking at profit, in addition to some of these other factors about where this person's career might go.
All right, my last question for you is, what do you think is the biggest thing people do wrong with networking? I know you do a lot more speaking engagements and more like kind of invite-only events with CEOs and founders, et cetera, with Fortune. But over the years, what do you think is something that people don't do right when networking?
Yeah, I would say it all comes down to just being a human and being a person and being authentic and thinking about building relationships. Personally, in networking situations, I always try to just talk to someone like a human being. I think oftentimes what can go wrong in networking is if you're like just dialing in and approaching someone and you're like, I'm trying to add this contact to my Rolodex, you're not really approaching it in like a human way. And so I think just being authentic, building relationships, sometimes you gel with people, sometimes you don't, and figuring out what you can do together in either case can be really helpful.
What makes you fearless?
What makes me fearless? I think about some of the things that, I think about my dad, who was a journalist, and he passed away. And
sorry.
Oh, no, thank you. But I think going through something like that, it makes you less scared of things that matter less, and you're able to kind of brush things off and know what matters and what doesn't. And so I think that makes me not too scared to try things, because, time is short. People are thinking about you less than you think they are.
Yeah, I agree
you can
with
just put yourself out there, and, you can know when something goes wrong, you know if it really matters or if it's not a big deal, and you can move on.
Emma, you are amazing. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
I will put all of your information, where to follow you, potentially even pitch you, in the show notes. And again, shout out to Slush. We love Slush.
I do. And congrats on your show. We didn't talk about Connecticut.
We're going to after this. I need a short video. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Head to the show notes to find out more about Emma and her work at Fortune, as well as Dare to be Fearless. And if you want to get a discount for Chief Swag Mike covers, you can do that in the show notes too. And I'll see you back next week for a new episode of Dare to be Fearless.